The sun was dropping low, pouring gold over the rooftops and turning the dust in the street to a glowing haze. Jonas McCade rode through that light like he'd done 100 times before, though this evening the town's air carried a strange charge. His horse's hooves made a slow, deliberate rhythm on the packed dirt, each step sounding louder than it ought to. From porches and open windows, eyes followed him, some out of habit, some with suspicion. A man like Jonas was easy to read, kept to himself, spoke when needed, worked hard, but tonight something tugged at his gaze, something pulling him toward the general store. She stood there like she'd been rooted to the spot by shame, yet her spine refused to bend. Clara Boone. Her dress, pale blue once, was torn at the hem, her hair loose, strands stuck to the side of her face where dried blood traced the line of her cheekbone. In one arm she held a small girl whose chin was buried against her neck. Another, older by a few years, clung to her skirts and stared at the ground. Around them, the street seemed to tilt, people leaning into one another, murmuring in low tones. The sewing circle women whispered like a wind moving through brittle grass, eyes darting to her and back again as though even glancing too long might invite scandal. Harlan Pike, who never let good gossip die quiet, leaned on the saloon rail, lips pressed around a knowing smirk. Jonas dismounted without hurry, tying his horse to the hitching post. He'd heard bits of talk before, how Clara's husband had wanted a son, how the man's temper could strip the warmth from a room. But this, seeing her here, bruised and holding those girls close, was different from hearing it over a whiskey glass. She wasn't crying. That was the thing that caught him. A woman who could take a public blow and keep her tears to herself carried something worth noticing. Clara adjusted her grip on the younger girl, pressing a hand to the older's shoulder, a silent promise she couldn't say aloud. Her lip trembled just enough for Jonas to see. She didn't look at him at first. She looked at the dust, at her own shoes, at anywhere the weight of pity might not find her. But when his shadow fell across her, she lifted her head, and her eyes, tired, guarded, but not hollow, met his. "You're coming with me," Jonas said. No preamble, no explanation. Just a plain statement that felt heavier than the words aloud. Clara blinked, her brow tightening. "I don't know you." "You don't need to," he replied, voice even. "You just need a place that ain't here." The murmurs swelled. A woman near the store countered with a sharp whisper, something about impropriety, about shame. Harlan chuckled, tossing his head like he'd just seen a show worth the price of admission. Clara straightened a little, pride pressing back against the urge to flinch. "I'm fine," she said, though the bruise blooming along her jaw made a liar of her. Jonas's eyes shifted, not to her face but to the ground where a small, cloth doll lay in the dust. He bent, picked it up, brushed away the dirt, and offered it to the little one in her arms. Rose's tiny hand reached out, clutching it with a soft, almost startled gratitude. That was the moment Clara's resistance thinned. She looked to Maggie, who hadn't taken her eyes off Jonas since he appeared. Something in the girl's gaze, cautious hope, the kind that's been burned before, tipped the balance. Without another word, Jonas untied his horse and swung up into the saddle. He extended a hand. Clara hesitated for one last heartbeat, then took it, and he pulled her up behind him. The older girl wrapped her arms around his waist, the younger tucked between them. The townsfolk's whispers followed, sharp and stinging, snapping in the air like twigs underfoot. The road out of town unspooled under them, the horizon stretching into night. Clara kept her eyes on the land ahead, though she felt the pull of the place they'd left behind, its watching windows, its small cruelties. The ride was long and quiet, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft breathing of her daughters as they began to drift toward sleep. Moonlight painted silver along the fence lines, the prairie grass shifting in slow waves under a wind that smelled of rain far off. Jonas said little, but when he did, his voice was low, almost meant for himself. "We'll be there by morning." Clara studied the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands rested steady on the reins. She wondered if she'd just stepped from one danger into another, yet something in his stillness made her think of a deep river, quiet on the surface but not without strength beneath. They reached the ranch when the stars were high and bright, scattered like lantern light across the black sky. The place rose out of the land with a sturdy humility, barn to the left, house to the right, corrals stretching out behind. The smell of hay mixed with the faint tang of leather and smoke. Jonas swung down first, then lifted the girls, setting them gently on the packed earth. He led them into the house without fuss, lighting a lamp that filled the space with a golden glow. The room he showed them was plain, a bed, a small chest, a window looking east, but clean. "You can sleep here," he said simply. He didn't linger in the doorway, didn't search her face for thanks or compliance. He stepped back, leaving her the space to claim the room as her own. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the wooden frame cool beneath her hands. She listened to the frogs in the distance, the low hum of night settling over the ranch. Her bruises throbbed in time with her heartbeat, but the air in the room felt different, less sharp, less watchful. Maggie curled up beside Rose, clutching the mended doll. Clara brushed a strand of hair from Maggie's face. "We'll be safe tonight," she whispered, unsure if she believed it yet but knowing the words mattered. From somewhere beyond the doorway, Jonas's boots creaked softly against the floorboards, then stilled. The sound wasn't threatening. It was an anchor, marking his presence without intrusion. Clara lay back, staring at the shadowed beams above. She could feel the pull of exhaustion, but sleep came slow. The quiet was almost too big, like stepping into a space you don't yet know how to fill. She thought of the road they'd taken, the looks that followed, the hand that had lifted her from the dust without demanding anything in return. In the dark, she closed her eyes, holding on to the thought that tomorrow might not be worse than today. That maybe, out here where the night stretched wide and the stars burned steady, the world could turn in a different direction. Outside, Jonas stood on the porch, the night wind lifting the brim of his hat. He watched the dark line of the horizon, the same way he always had, except now there were 3 sleeping figures in his house. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, only that the decision was already made. And in that quiet, with the crickets sawing their steady song, he realized it wasn't loneliness that filled the ranch tonight, it was the weight of something beginning. The days unfolded slowly, the kind of rhythm that didn't rush a soul but measured time in sunrises and suppers. Clara moved through the house as though learning the steps to a dance she hadn't known existed. She mended a shirt at the table while Maggie read aloud in a soft, halting voice, and Rose rolled a wooden spool back and forth on the floor. Outside, Jonas worked the cattle in long, patient circuits, the lowing of the herd drifting toward the house like a distant hum. Neither he nor Clara spoke much, but the silences began to loosen, their edges blunted by the small ways they tended to each other without remark. The girls grew bolder. Maggie followed Jonas to the barn one morning, trailing him like a shadow until he handed her a brush and pointed to a patient old mare. She grinned when he didn't take it back but let her work, her small arms moving in determined strokes. Rose sat in the doorway of the coop, watching hens with wide-eyed fascination. Their laughter, light, tentative, found its way into the air again, and Clara felt something in her chest stir, a warmth she'd kept buried for years. In town, the story twisted and grew in the telling. Harlan Pike, leaning on the saloon's railing, swore to anyone willing to listen that McCade had taken her in, like some outlaw snatching up a stray. Mrs. Langley at the mercantile muttered about impropriety, about the example set for young women. By the time the gossip reached Mrs. Eunice Carter, it carried the flavor of scandal seasoned with pity. One afternoon, Eunice appeared at the ranch uninvited, her bonnet tied tight, arms cradling a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Jonas met her at the porch, but she sidestepped him as though she'd known him since birth, which, in truth, she nearly had. "Jonas McCade, you've got yourself a fine mess," she said, glancing pointedly toward the house where Clara stood in the doorway, drying her hands. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the old shame stirring like a rattler in the grass. She braced for Jonas to distance himself, to offer some polite deflection that would put her outside his walls again. Instead, he said, "If folks are talking, it means they're watching from far away. We're fine here." His tone was steady, almost bored, but Clara caught the undercurrent, something closer to a quiet claim. After Eunice left, Clara lingered in the kitchen, her fingers tracing the wood grain of the counter. She wasn't sure if his words were meant for her ears, but they settled into her like a stone in still water, sending out slow ripples. As autumn edged into the air, the ranch began to feel less like a place she was passing through and more like a map she could learn by heart. Jonas taught Maggie how to guide the mare with just the pressure of her knees. Clara began to rise early to bake bread, the smell weaving through the house so that Jonas often came in mid-morning, pretending some errand in the kitchen. On a cold, wet evening, a leak in the girls' room brought Jonas from his chair without a word. He climbed onto the roof in the rain, hammer in hand, while Clara watched from the doorway, the lamplight behind her throwing a long shadow across the porch. It was in those quiet acts, his fixing, her mending, the way they shared the weight of the day without tallying, that something unspoken began to take shape between them. Not love, not yet, but the raw, sturdy frame of it. Then the news came on a sharp wind. Harlan rode out one afternoon, his hat pulled low, eyes flicking to the horizon as though he didn't want to be the one to carry it. Clara's husband was back in town. Drunk, loud, telling anyone who'd hear that he'd be reclaiming what's his before the week was out. Harlan told Jonas straight, though his gaze kept sliding to Clara, who had gone pale at the first word. Jonas didn't ask questions. "He won't take what he threw away," he said, voice low enough that it felt carved in stone. That night, Clara sat at the table long after the girls had gone to bed, her fingers tight around a mug she hadn't sipped from in minutes. "He'll come here," she said, not as a question. Jonas didn't deny it. The lamp between them flickered as the wind rattled the windows. "Then we'll be here," he said simply, as if the matter were already decided. The next afternoon, the sound of hooves cut through the air, sharp and impatient. Clara's breath tightened. Her husband's figure emerged from the dust, broad, unsteady in the saddle, rage shaping his mouth before he spoke. He reined in at the edge of the yard, shouting her name like it was something he owned. Jonas stepped out onto the porch. His hands were empty, but his presence was heavy as a storm about to break. The man's eyes slid over him and fixed on Clara, who had come to stand just inside the doorway. "They're mine," he said, pointing toward the girls' room. His voice was thick with drink, his face drawn into the sneer she knew too well. "They're not things," Jonas replied, calm but with an edge that made the air feel smaller. "And they're not yours." The man dismounted, stumbling forward with fists clenched. He lunged, and Jonas met him halfway, not with fury, but with precision. One shove, a turn, and the man was in the dirt, coughing on the dust. Jonas didn't strike him again. The restraint was sharper than any blow. Clara stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath her bare feet. She moved to stand beside Jonas, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Her voice was steady, carrying more weight than she expected. "We are not yours." For a moment, the man looked at her like he didn't recognize her. Then something in him cracked, not with remorse, but with the realization that this door was shut to him forever. He muttered something low, mounted his horse, and rode off into the lengthening shadows. The silence that followed was not the brittle kind they'd known before, but the deep, grounding quiet of a place reclaimed. Jonas turned to her, searching her face for some sign, fear, relief, regret. What he found instead was a small, unguarded spark in her eyes. That night, they ate supper with the door locked and the windows latched, the lamplight drawing a warm circle around the table. The girls chattered about small things, Maggie's progress with the mare, Rose's discovery of an egg in the coop. Clara laughed at something Maggie said, the sound loosening a knot inside Jonas he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Later, when the girls were asleep, Clara lingered in the kitchen, wiping the table clean. Jonas stepped in, pausing in the doorway. Neither spoke, but the quiet between them had changed shape entirely. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain. Inside, the weight of the night settled, not with fear, but with the strange certainty that something had been decided, not by words, but by the way they'd stood together on that porch. And as Jonas reached for the lamp to turn it low, Clara's gaze met his, steady and unflinching, as if to say she knew exactly what choice had been made, and that it was hers as much as his.